At 5:42 a.m., in a cell no larger than a parking space, a man who hasn't touched another human being in 21 years wakes up to the same thing he saw yesterday. Beige concrete, stainless steel sink, and a hatch that opens only to deliver food. His name is Robert Hansen, former FBI agent, convicted traitor, the archetype of controlled intellect. He is one of 400 men held inside ADX Florence, America's highest security federal prison. This place is designed for those deemed too dangerous for human contact. But what if the danger is not what they brought in, but what the system builds inside them? This is not a story about monsters. It's a story about manufacturing monstrosity. Because at the heart of the world's most secure prison lies a paradox. To keep the nation safe, we must perfect the science of madness. When Thomas Harris invented Hannibal Lecter, he gave evil a face of refinement, intelligence weaponized by isolation. But while Lecter was fictional, the laboratory that could create him is not. In 1994, the Bureau of Prisons completed construction of ADX Florence, Colorado, an architectural machine built to house men whose very thoughts were considered threats. Its purpose was not punishment. It was containment of cognition. Today, this facility holds the most notorious names in American criminal history. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Ramzi Youssef, architect of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. Yet beneath the concrete and protocols lies a deeper question. If you take a mind and deprive it of stimulus long enough, does it rot, or does it evolve? This film investigates that question. It examines how architecture, bureaucracy, and isolation converge to shape identity, and how a system built to suppress evil might, paradoxically, refine it. To understand ADX Florence, we must begin in Marion, Illinois, 1983. There, 2 correctional officers were murdered by members of the Aryan Brotherhood. The response was immediate and absolute. Marion went into permanent lockdown. Cells were sealed, movement ceased, and the concept of the control unit prison was born. The Bureau of Prisons realized something profound and dangerous. If you couldn't reform chaos, you could quarantine it. By the early 1990s, as gang violence and terrorism intensified, policymakers envisioned a central facility that would embody total control. It would be called ADX Florence, part of the Federal Correctional Complex in Fremont County, Colorado. Construction began in 1991. Cost, $60 million. Design brief, escape-proof, disturbance-proof, assault-proof. It opened in November 1994. The first warden, Robert Hood, would later call it a clean version of hell. ADX Florence was not built like a prison. It was built like a behavioral laboratory. Every inch of architecture serves psychological function. Cells, 7 by 12 feet, soundproofed, with immovable fixtures. Windows, 4 inches wide, angled upward so inmates can see only sky. Doors, triple-layered steel bars, mesh grille, and a solid security panel. Lighting, fluorescent, 24 hours a day, eliminating circadian rhythm. Movement, 1 hour of recreation daily in a concrete pen known as the cage. There are no communal meals, no direct human contact. Even medical checks occur through steel ports. ADX was designed under a principle known as administrative control. It operates not through overt punishment but through the management of sensory input. In other words, its true instrument is not discipline, but deprivation. The Bureau of Prisons describes ADX as necessary for the safe and humane management of inmates who pose a continuing threat. The phrase safe and humane is a masterpiece of bureaucratic irony. It reframes isolation as compassion. In policy manuals, ADX is categorized as a Level 6 facility, the highest in the federal system. Placement is based on behavior, not sentence. You can earn your way in. You cannot necessarily earn your way out. Critics call this permanent administrative exile. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, have compared it to sensory torture. The Bureau counters that inmates have access to television, radio, and correspondence. But what television means to a man who hasn't spoken in a decade is another matter entirely. Inside ADX, the contest is not between inmate and officer. It's between inmate and self. The architecture enforces solitude so absolute that the mind begins to substitute imagination for experience. A 2015 psychiatric study of ADX conditions found that after 1 year in solitary, over 40% of inmates developed confined hallucination syndrome. They heard footsteps in walls, voices through vents, whispers from drains. In several cases, those whispers turned into dialogues. The Bureau calls these coping mechanisms. Psychiatrists call them self-generated sociality, the brain's desperate attempt to replace absent humanity. Here, the fiction of Hannibal Lecter meets its mirror. Lecter's calm, cultured manner in the dark cell is often cited as evidence of genius. In truth, it's what prolonged isolation does to language. It distills speech into precision, compresses thought into ritual, polishes madness into eloquence. The monster is not born brilliant. He becomes articulate because silence is his only companion. When Ted Kaczynski arrived at ADX in 1998, he described it in a letter as an environment designed to crush the human spirit. Kaczynski, once a mathematics prodigy, found himself studying the flight paths of insects that wandered into his recreation cage. Each ant, each bird became a point of fascination, a new form of data. Inmates like Ramzi Youssef spent years crafting intricate daily schedules, dividing 24 hours into precise intervals to maintain sanity. Others, like Thomas Silverstein, never adjusted. Silverstein, the man whose 1983 killings triggered the creation of the Supermax model, would spend 36 years in uninterrupted isolation, dying in his cell in 2019. His death certificate listed cause of death as cardiac arrest. But psychologically, he had been dead for decades. From a policy standpoint, ADX is not about cruelty, it's about efficiency. The system's genius lies in its self-sufficiency. One officer can supervise multiple inmates without risk of contact or collusion. Every hallway camera, every motion sensor replaces human oversight. The result is a closed feedback loop of control. No riots, no escapes, no scandals that can't be managed through paperwork. When asked about the mental health crisis inside, one former warden said, "We didn't create these men. We just contain them." But containment is never neutral. A system that defines its success by silence eventually creates it, literally. You count seconds because time no longer arrives in minutes. You talk to your reflection in the stainless sink because it's the only face left. When the air duct hums, you imagine conversation. When the light flickers, you pretend it's weather. You are not hallucinating. You are constructing stimuli. Your brain refuses extinction. You remember books, Silence of the Lambs, maybe. You used to laugh at the scenes of Lecter sitting perfectly still. Now you understand stillness as violence. You remember books, Silence of the Lambs, maybe. You used to laugh at the scenes of Lecter sitting perfectly still. Now you understand stillness as violence. You think about the camera above your door. You smile at it sometimes, just to prove you still can. Somewhere in Washington, a report notes your stable adjustment. They don't know the smile isn't sanity. It's surrender. The Bureau of Prisons calls ADX a self-contained correctional environment. In truth, it is a closed cognitive ecosystem, a laboratory where behavior is the dependent variable and architecture is the experiment. Internal documents obtained through FOIA show that ADX conducts ongoing behavioral observation assessments, tracking how inmates react to isolation stimuli, frequency of complaints, volume of speech during daily checks, body posture on camera. The goal is to predict volatility. In practice, it quantifies suffering. The system measures humanity in metrics, anger, silence, compliance, and calls the result science. Public fascination with figures like Lecter and Kaczynski feeds the myth that intellect and evil are intertwined. But inside ADX, the opposite is often true. Most inmates are not calculating sociopaths. They are deteriorated organisms of a controlled environment. When the brain is deprived of conversation, it begins to feed on itself. Language collapses inward. Thought becomes cyclical. Intellect doesn't sharpen, it corrodes. The real-life Hannibal Lecter isn't a man. It's the system, a mindless intelligence that refines isolation into precision. ADX Florence reflects not just the inmates, but the civilization that built it. It is America's subconscious made concrete, a belief that control equals safety, that silence equals peace, that containment equals justice. Yet the more we perfect confinement, the more we resemble the minds we claim to suppress. We build walls not to hold monsters, but to hide our need for them. Every cell at ADX is a confession in architecture, an admission that we do not know how to rehabilitate, only how to neutralize. And every locked door is a mirror that asks. ADX Florence was designed around a concept borrowed from behavioral psychology: total stimulus control. In classical conditioning experiments, animals could be trained to associate light or sound with punishment. At ADX, humans are the subjects, and the stimulus is absence itself. The cells are engineered to minimize every form of input. No view of the horizon, no direct light variation, no sound except your own, no texture beyond concrete. The Bureau of Prisons calls this environmental stability. Psychiatrists call it deprivation conditioning. Within months, the body adjusts to stillness. The brain does not. Functional MRI studies on long-term solitary confinement survivors show reduced gray matter in the hippocampus, the region responsible for memory, orientation, and emotion regulation. One neuroscientist described it bluntly: they lose the ability to imagine sequence. Without sequence, there is no future. Isolation at this scale doesn't just prevent escape. It dismantles time. Every ADX unit follows a logic of segmentation. Each corridor isolates 8 cells, each cell isolates one mind, and each mind is rendered manageable by deprivation. Architecturally, this design has no accident. It was refined through decades of iteration, from Marion's Control Unit, 1979, to Florence's H Unit, 1994, to later prototypes like Thompson, Illinois. A former bureau architect once said, "You can design behavior if you can design the environment." At ADX, this belief became policy. Corridors are lined with acoustic baffles to suppress inmate communication. Air vents are narrow enough to prevent conversation. Even the recreation cages, open-air pens, are positioned so inmates can't see each other. Every feature denies intersubjectivity, the recognition that someone else exists. Without that recognition, empathy erodes. Without empathy, the system's ethics disappear along with the inmate's humanity. This is how architecture becomes ideology. ADX includes a rehabilitation sequence known as the step-down program, designed to transition compliant inmates into lesser restrictions. On paper, it looks progressive: phases of gradually restored privileges, limited group activity, monitored recreation, controlled social contact. In reality, it's a behavioral trap. The program's criteria are subjective: compliance, attitude, absence of negative interaction. But these are measured by staff interpretation of surveillance footage, not by clinical evaluation. Inmates must demonstrate social skills they've been denied the chance to practice. One federal report summarized the problem succinctly: to prove readiness for human interaction, the inmate must first survive its absence. The irony is surgical. The system demands humanity as proof of survival, after removing the conditions that allow humanity to exist. Human interaction at ADX is mediated through steel and glass. Officers communicate via intercom. Psychiatrists speak through reinforced windows. A 2016 investigation found that staff were instructed to limit unnecessary dialogue to reduce manipulation risks. This policy effectively eliminated emotional engagement from supervision. Over time, even staff began reporting empathic fatigue, a dissociative numbness from prolonged exposure to unresponsive subjects. The result: a two-way psychological corrosion. Inmates lose identity through isolation. Staff lose empathy through repetition. It's not just a prison. It's a mutual experiment in dehumanization. Inside ADX, control is absolute, but it is also performative. Everything is surveilled, recorded, and cataloged. Food portions, shower duration, tone of voice. This abundance of data creates a paradox. The more the Bureau knows about its inmates, the less it understands them. Control becomes fetishized. Staff culture begins to view deviation not as behavior but as betrayal. One retired warden recalled, "At ADX, order becomes religion. The moment you question it, you're seen as compromised." In this environment, compliance is not a goal. It's a creed. And those who fail to meet its rituals are classified as irredeemable. Originally, ADX was built to contain violence. Now it houses thought. Over time, the Bureau expanded its definition of dangerous inmate to include those with ideological influence, radical preachers, organized crime leaders, high-profile terrorists. The idea was to cut off the contagion of influence. But what happens when a system begins to fear influence itself? Letters are scanned, calls monitored, visits restricted, reading lists censored. Intellectual isolation replaces physical punishment. In effect, ADX became the first institution in modern history to imprison ideas. You start mapping your world by echo. The hum of the ventilation tells you which floor you're on. The timing of footsteps tells you who's on duty. The sound of the food slot tells you if they like you. You stop counting days, time becomes tactile, measured in air pressure and noise. Eventually, you invent conversations. Not with others, but with fragments of yourself. A version of you argues the case. Another version defends it. A third moderates the debate. You begin to recognize their voices as distinct. One calm, one pleading, one laughing. They are you, divided by architecture. When you hear someone scream 2 units away, you envy them. Screaming means sound still matters. You whisper back into the vent. Sometimes the vent whispers back. In internal documents, these symptoms are categorized as behavioral deviations. The language converts anguish into data. The Bureau's official diagnostic framework reduces psychological collapse to measurable variables. Auditory misperception incidents. Verbal self-dialogue patterns. Environmental response deficit. Each phrase disguises pain as performance. This is the quiet genius of administrative systems. They can document horror without ever acknowledging it. As long as it fits into a spreadsheet, it remains professional. Supermax facilities rely on a narrative of necessity. The public must believe these places hold something beyond redemption, the worst of the worst. This mythology is vital. Without it, the architecture becomes indefensible. So the Bureau cultivates legends: the bomber, the spy, the killer. Each inmate's name becomes shorthand for chaos contained. But in reality, over half of ADX inmates are not terrorists or mass murderers. Many were transferred for fighting, for hoarding contraband, or for disobeying orders. The category most dangerous becomes elastic, stretched to justify existence. Thus, the monster is manufactured twice. Once by crime, again by system. Ted Kaczynski's cell was identical to every other cell. 4 inches of window, 23 hours of isolation, 1 hour of exercise alone. But what distinguished him was not his intellect, it was how isolation reshaped it. In letters smuggled to journalists, Kaczynski described his thoughts as becoming crystalline. He reported the mind working in loops, refining each sentence until it became too perfect to write down. Psychiatrists reading his notes observed a phenomenon known as hyperreflectivity, the pathological intensification of self-conscious thought. When you have no external input, your internal dialogue becomes infinite. This is the paradox of intellectual isolation. Polishes thought until it fractures. The brilliance that once produced equations now produces labyrinths. Kaczynski died by suicide in 2023. In the end, even the system that built him couldn't bear its own reflection. From a forensic standpoint, the manufacture of monsters follows a predictable pattern. Stage 1. Containment, restrict movement and sensory input. Stage 2. Compression, internal thought replaces external feedback. Stage 3. Distortion, reality becomes interpretive. Stage 4. Dissociation, the self becomes multiple, fragmented, ungovernable. At stage 4, control becomes impossible. Yet bureaucratically, the system reads this as compliance. No incidents, no violence, no escape. The absence of behavior is mistaken for peace. But peace born of collapse is indistinguishable from death. The guards at ADX are not immune. Working in perpetual silence corrodes the human psyche in subtler ways. Many officers report time drift, the sense that shifts blend into each other. Some develop mirror symptoms: insomnia, irritability, hypervigilance. One retired CO described it as being haunted by men you never hear. The system creates behavioral symmetry. Both sides become reflections of control, one enforced, one internalized. Thus, ADX doesn't just contain monsters. It distributes their logic. Imagine a structure that feeds on silence. Each cell a lung inhaling compliance, exhaling emptiness. Each corridor a neural pathway transmitting control signals. ADX is not a building. It's a cognitive architecture, an algorithm that converts deviance into data, then into justification for its own existence. This is what philosopher Michel Foucault predicted when he wrote that the prison reproduces the power that invented it. Florence is not a response to evil. It is the embodiment of the state's fear of unpredictability. It manufactures monsters to prove itself necessary. You remember the movies. Hannibal Lecter, impeccable, witty, brilliant. You imagine him in your cell. You envy him. He talked to Clarice. He had someone listening. He could still seduce with words. You try speaking like him once, softly, rhythmically. Comforts you for a day. Then you realize the system doesn't need a Lecter. It only needs you silent. So you stop pretending to be human. You start pretending to be manageable. That's how you survive. That's how they win. Every few years, lawsuits challenge ADX on grounds of cruel and unusual punishment. Each time, the Bureau modifies procedure, rebrands terminology, and continues. Solitary confinement becomes restricted housing. Torture becomes enhanced management. Isolation becomes administrative control. Language mutates faster than morality. And as long as the public fears the men behind those walls, the architecture remains sacred, an altar of safety built on invisible suffering. The irony is almost divine. The system designed to prevent violence depends on psychological violence to function. It doesn't destroy monsters. It designs them carefully, procedurally, indefinitely. What begins as containment ends as creation. What begins as order ends as entropy. And somewhere in the middle, a man whispers through the vent. They wanted Hannibal Lecter, so they built him. It leaks outward into courtrooms, policy meetings, psychiatric wards, and the collective imagination of a nation that confuses control with justice. When a federal judge reviews a Supermax appeal, they are rarely shown photographs of cells. They see diagrams, data sheets, compliance summaries. The human element has already been redacted. This is how the architecture reproduces itself, not by concrete, but by language sanitized of empathy. Each time the courts affirm its constitutionality, ADX expands in concept. It becomes a template, exported to state systems. California's Pelican Bay, Illinois Thames, Virginia's Red Onion. What was once the exception becomes a managerial model. The monster is now policy. Public fascination sustains the myth of necessity. Documentaries, dramatizations, inside ADX specials. Each reinforces the narrative that these walls hold evil contained. But silence, when institutionalized, alters perception. When society stops hearing screams, it begins to forget they ever existed. This normalization functions like collective amnesia. The same citizens who recoil from torture abroad accept it at home under the name security. It's not that people endorse cruelty. It's that the system's sophistication hides it too well. ADX succeeds because it teaches the public to equate quiet with safety. And once a democracy confuses silence for order, it forgets how to measure harm. When they finally release you, the first sound that frightens you is wind. You haven't heard randomness in years. Every noise inside ADX had intention. Keys, locks, intercom. Outside, the world moves without pattern, and that chaos feels dangerous. You flinch at conversation. You mistrust laughter. You crave walls. Doctors call it institutional dependency, the psyche's addiction to control. But it feels simpler than that. Freedom hurts the ears. You keep your apartment dark. You walk in straight lines. When people talk too long, your mind edits their words into data. Tone, cadence, deviation. You have become what the system required, an organism of surveillance, self-regulated, self-contained. You are out, yet you are still inside. When isolation becomes the method of governance, intellect itself changes function. In ADX, thinking is no longer creative. It's defensive. Each thought must be repeatable, measurable, safe. Innovation, once the hallmark of civilization, becomes risk. That ethos bleeds into bureaucratic culture. Decision-makers emulate the prison they fund. Minimal contact, maximum control, zero vulnerability. We build governments the way we build supermaxes, risk-averse, procedurally infallible, emotionally vacant. The architecture migrates from stone to system. The result is a society that manages itself through isolation. Citizens algorithmically separated, conversations filtered, dissent neutralized by invisibility. ADX Florence was never just a prison. It was a prototype for how to control populations without visible chains. Litigation against Supermax conditions follows a predictable trajectory. Inmate alleges cruel and unusual punishment. Government cites safety and security interests. Court defers to administrative expertise. In 2017, a federal judge in Colorado acknowledged that ADX conditions may approach the outer limits of constitutional tolerance, then dismissed the case on grounds of qualified immunity. The phrase outer limits encapsulates the moral geometry of Supermax law. The edge of legality is precisely where we choose to live. Justice does not fail here by accident. It fails by design, the same design that shaped the cells. Every institution that touches ADX absorbs part of its logic. The Bureau of Prisons measures success in incidents prevented, not lives rehabilitated. Law enforcement training adopts Supermax terminology, containment zones, behavioral modification techniques. Even corporate security systems borrow its language of segmentation and compliance tracking. This is how a prison becomes a culture. What was once a response to violence becomes the blueprint for management everywhere. The logic of ADX is not confined to Florence, Colorado. It now lives in HR departments, algorithms, and social media filters. We have learned to police ourselves with the efficiency of Supermax wardens. Politicians defend ADX with one sentence: it keeps us safe. But safety, like silence, is a relative term. A system that isolates the violent does not eliminate violence. It redistributes it. Inside, it erupts in self-harm. Outside, it mutates into fear. Communities accept the logic of containment until they replicate it. Locking away addicts, the homeless, the mentally ill. Each new category makes the original architecture look reasonable. We call it public order. It is simply expanding geometry. We thought we were building a solution. We were building a mirror. Every line we drew was a fear made tangible. The windows we shrunk were our own doubts about mercy. The walls we thickened were our refusal to forgive. He pauses. Sometimes I wonder if Florence was the first self-portrait America ever built. Modern neuroscience confirms what ancient philosophy intuited. Consciousness requires relationship. MRI scans of monks, artists, and solitary prisoners reveal the same truth from opposite ends of experience. The mind is a social organ. Deprivation does not purify thought. It atrophies it. The Supermax experiment has therefore proved its own futility. You cannot isolate evil without isolating everything human around it. Every cell in ADX is a failed laboratory of ethics. 10. The public mirror. Hannibal Lecter thrives in fiction because he represents the fantasy of control. A monster caged, civilized, comprehensible. ADX offers the same comfort. Evil neatly contained in a box. But fiction ends with closure. Reality does not. The real Lecters we imprison are not operatic villains. They are the ruins of systems that mistook architecture for justice. When we consume stories of mad genius in chains, we affirm the myth that intellect and evil belong together, and so we keep building cells for minds we fear to understand. Forensic analysis reveals the pattern. Philosophy confronts the implication. If the purpose of prison is control and control destroys the self, then the system's success equals human erasure. If erasure is victory, then the moral foundation of justice has reversed. The Supermax is therefore not a failure of ethics but its inversion. It achieves what it was designed to prevent: the creation of monsters. A camera mounted above a cell door records a man sleeping. It never blinks. Somewhere in a control room, another man watches the screen. The observer and the observed share the same stillness. Who is the prisoner now? If civilization is measured by how it treats its worst, then ADX Florence is America's truest mirror. It shows us what happens when safety replaces compassion and efficiency replaces understanding. The lesson is not to free monsters. It is to question the systems that need them to exist. Perhaps the real Hannibal Lecter was never a man but an idea, the belief that evil can be isolated through control. Every Supermax cell is a chapter in that myth. Yet if we listen closely, beneath the ventilation and the fluorescent buzz, we might hear another sound. Our own civilization, slowly learning to speak in whispers. Monsters, it says, are manufactured in the name of safety. And safety, it replies, is the quietest form of violence.